Welcome to the District of Sports podcast. I'm George Gerbo. We are excited here at the Washington Times to relaunch District of Sports and broaden our conversations surrounding the sports teams and sporting events in and around the Capital Beltway and beyond, with episodes coming out semi-monthly and typically on Thursdays or Fridays. You can find the District of Sports on all of your favorite podcast platforms. Just search District of Sports wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us on Twitter at WashTimesSports and for myself at Gerbo3. It's May, the time when the three jewels of horse racing's Triple Crown command our attention. But as the 148th running of the Preakness Stakes up in Baltimore at Pimlico Racecourse takes place on May 20th, the sport of horse racing has been marred by multiple deaths following the 149th running of the Kentucky Derby on May 6th. A total of 8 different horses died, 5 of them in the days leading up to the Derby, 2 of them on Derby Day, and 1 a race the day following the Derby after the horse crossed the finish line. Additionally, 4 horses were scratched from the Kentucky Derby field. That's the most ever that have been scratched from the Derby. Now, as Pimlico and the Preakness take the stage, there's a lot of attention and still some uncertainty surrounding the health and welfare of these horses. Kentucky Derby winner Mage is the only horse from the Derby that will compete at the Preakness. To try to understand what's happening in the industry, I talked with Wayne Pacelle, the president of DC-based nonprofit Animal Wellness Action, to get into the issue and any potential ways to make the sport and the horses themselves safer. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us.
George, good to be with you.
We are joining at kind of a crossroads, I would say, for the horse racing industry. The Kentucky Derby is one of the most widely viewed events, one of the most biggest attended events, obviously, in the state of Kentucky. And this, in the lead up to it, we had 7 deaths, a couple on Derby Day. We had training and incidents before the Derby. Even in races at Churchill Downs on Sunday, the day after the Derby, a horse had an issue after the race and had to be euthanized. Is there, and we had a record leading into the race, 4 horses were scratched, which was a record going into the Derby as well. Is there an easy answer or explanation of why now so many of these incidents like this are happening on track?
No, I don't think it's a simple answer. I think it's multifactorial. It's even difficult to kind of disentangle, what the causes are. I think that is what Kentucky or Churchill Downs authorities are doing. But one thing I can say for sure, it doesn't reflect well in the racing industry. And I feel like there's just been a drumbeat of concerns about horse racing. I see it within the animal welfare community. There are a lot of concerns about factory farming, about animal fighting, about horse slaughter, about, the trade in wildlife. Horse racing was always kind of like, I don't really like it very much. A lot of animal advocates, but, it's horses are made to run. It's okay. It's a small number of animals at risk. And I just hear the animal welfare movement turning much more against horse racing than I ever have because of what happened at Santa Anita in 2019 and, past breakdowns of high-profile horses. When you think of the biggest stages of horse racing, like the Kentucky Derby, like an esteemed track like Santa Anita, and these things are happening, you can only conclude that at the minor league tracks in West Virginia or New Mexico or Oklahoma, that things are even worse. And I think that is really causing some concerns. At the same time, George, let me say the passage of the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act is a whole new day for horse racing. And I think that presents an incredible opportunity for the industry to show that it's playing by new rules for safety for horses.
Yeah, that's a good transition point. You mentioned Santa Anita, 42 horses back 2019 died there at Santa Anita Park in California. And so Congress passes the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act in 2020, and somewhat ironically, somewhat unfortunately, it will have its authority go into effect here 2 days after the Preakness Stakes on Monday. What kind of authority will the HISA have to enforce or to regulate? Because a lot of this, when we see these troubles in the industry, a lot of it comes down to the trainers, and you've got some trainers that, Bob Baffert was not, he's still suspended from Churchill Downs, but he'll be at the Preakness with a horse on Saturday. National Treasure, but was suspended from last year's Preakness and last year's Belmont Stakes. You've got Safi Joseph, who was suspended. 2 of his horses died at Churchill Downs this past weekend or 2 weekends ago. A third horse was scratched, and it seems like there's Todd Pletcher, I believe, is suspended as well, or is pending a suspension. He's appealed that. Championship winning trainer that he is. Will this act and will this authority have any kind of regulatory power to be able to suspend or have more power than currently exists in the industry?
Oh, no question. It's a big change, and the authority has power. The question is, will it seize that power and obviously exercise that power in a proper yet stern way? I mean, if it just sees itself as just some kind of like general, like, oh, we're gonna keep our eye on things, it doesn't do anything, then everyone's going to revert to the same bad behaviors. So this is a new sheriff in town, and it really depends on the resolve and the vision and the fortitude of the people at the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority. They've got the power to deal with track safety. The big item for discussion was no race day doping of horses. Horses are doped to enhance performance, and they're doped to get injured horses on the track and get them into competition. That's a big deal. Drugging and doping have been terrible problems in racing. And this Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority needs to have strong rules and enforce them, and suspensions and other appropriate penalties. But that's not where its authority ends. I mean, it can look into anything when it comes to track safety. And, the Horsemen's Benevolent Protective Association has been suing under various legal theories to invalidate HISA. And that is unfortunate. It's a lot of trainers. I mean, it sure seems that they just want to continue to do things the way they've been doing. The problem with racing is 38 different racing jurisdictions. So you can have Baffert suspended in Kentucky, but not in Maryland. I mean, uniformity is what's needed. You don't have, the Miami Dolphins with a different set of rules, when they're playing in Florida, and then when they're going to play the Detroit Lions, then the Michigan rules are different. Same thing in baseball, the same thing in cycling, the same thing in so many other sports. It's a national industry or it's not. And, Congress has had the authority to take action. It didn't do it because of the view within the industry that, oh, we can handle everything, or the state authorities. And finally it did. And it was that drumbeat of incidents and doping cases and so much, frankly, corruption in racing. I mean, how can you be a gambler and feel decent about it when people are juicing the horses? I just don't see how that conforms. So I think it's a new day. I think it's really exciting, but it really depends on the resolve of the authority.
I'm kind of reminded of boxing in some ways, where when you fight in Nevada, there are certain things that you can, whether it's UFC or boxing, there's certain things that regulation wise in terms of the lead up and what fighters can do and can't do, and et cetera, than if you fought in Florida, or if you fought in, it seems like the sport would benefit from some sort of national, I'm almost thinking like an NCAA style organization, because it's kind of NCAA is kind of a loose confederation. You have the conferences in college sports that have a lot of the authority, but there's still a governing body that some people would criticize that doesn't have too much power, but it's still a overall governing body. Something like that would be beneficial in horse racing.
Well, the problem is that the thoroughbred industry generally supported the HISA. The Horsemen's Benevolent Protective Association opposed it, that has been filing these lawsuits. But the harness racing folks, aren't on board yet, nor the quarter horse people. I think we've got to get HISA applied to all forms of horse racing. And I think that's the authority. I don't know beyond that what level of organization is going to work, but they've got the authority. As long as they have the personnel, I mean, a few things should be done. I mean, they should definitely ban the use of the crop or the whip, and I think they really have to set a goal for performance as well. It'll be a little more difficult to enforce, but they've got to have the moral authority to do this. Track deaths should be approaching zero. It shouldn't be normal to have a healthy young horse. I mean, these are the prime specimens in the industry. These are the best competitors. These are the equivalent of the best players in basketball or the best in baseball. They shouldn't be dying when they're competing. And somehow that's become a norm, or it's been accepted that, oh, this is the inevitable consequences of competition. Well, this is a nonviolent sport. We're told that the horses love to run. Well, if the horses love to run, they shouldn't die doing it. And, this is where the complexities come in. I mean, I think that the breeding issues are really significant. And you see this in dog breeding. You have dachshunds with bad backs. You have German shepherds with bad hips. You have Labradors that are prone to cancers. Breeding has health consequences for animals. And if you're breeding them for speed and not soundness, you're going to make them more vulnerable to breakdowns. But then you've got track surfaces. You've got, 3-year-old or 2-year-old racing before their, musculoskeletal systems, according to some, are fully developed. You've got the trainers and their behavior and frequency of racing. You've got disposition of poor performing horses. I mean, you've got so many different aspects of this. It's very complex. The authority will have a tough job, but there are very definite things it can do. And I would say take on these very specific items, ban on race day doping. That should be in place. The ban on whips. I mean, Bonnie Roberts, a famous horse whisperer, said, would we want to whip someone who's running a 100-yard dash or the 400 meters? I mean, it's distracting at the very least. The horses are competing. If they're competitors and they're trained, they shouldn't need to have a crop hitting them. And then I'd say, this new standard. I mean, it shouldn't be acceptable to have this many deaths. And when Santa Anita had the 42 deaths, they took actions and they reduced those numbers in subsequent years. And that should be the expectation. It should not be like, oh, it's so unfortunate that 8 horses died in a week and they just go on. There's got to be some larger examination of processes. I mean, Sappy Joseph had 2 horses drop dead. Obviously, he needs to be investigated. And, I'm quite sure something was amiss with him. Whether they find it or not, I don't know. But it's more than any one trainer. It's more than any one track. But if the track is really, contributing in some form, or it's the stage for a lot of deaths, then an examination needs to be done. It needs to be unpacked.
That's a excellent transition, because I'm trying to think of, as you delve into this, is it things that the, ownership and the farms can do to, better bring because a lot of it focuses on the trainers and can be, win at all costs type to get these horses that have a lot of money, whether it's in stud fees or just spent to purchase the horse and everything going on. And the ownership these days is so, fractured, where if you think of very historic, like Calumet Farm in Kentucky, one of these very notable farms that's produced triple crown competing horses. It seems like in the ownership now, with it being, if you owned a horse, I've obviously never owned anything like to come close to that, but if you owned a horse and were deeply involved in, I love this horse and want the best for it, when it's a smaller group, I would think that it might be a little bit more of a watchful eye on it. But now you've got so many different investors that can go in on one horse that's bred specifically to compete in Triple Crown races or compete in the Breeders' Cup or so on, that maybe there's less oversight coming from even the horse's ownership group at times.
Yeah. Well, and then you also, it's a good point, and then you have the pressures of the Triple Crown, right? I mean, that's for 3-year-olds, right? I mean, if you miss the opportunity, then you miss the opportunity. And you can hear some of the owners, with Todd Pletcher's horse, who was scratched for an injury. And now the rule under the HISA authority, even though HISA is not technically in effect, Maryland's saying it's going to be observing the principles or the standards. and there's a 2-week rest period for a horse who's scratched, so he can't run in the Preakness. Well, that's very disappointing to the ownership group for that horse. I can understand that. And there's a rule that he's out. But you can see when there's not a rule in place, someone may take a risk with a horse because that is such a fleeting opportunity to get your horse into the money.
You mentioned tracks earlier. These facilities or they're historic facilities, and that can have a lot of culture into it. And it can also be just old in a lot of ways. We've come a long way in other sports with more modern surfaces. We don't play on AstroTurf anymore because tremendous stress and injuries to people's ankles and knees and ACLs. And we've got better surfaces that are hybrid or synthetic or what have you. Are there things that these usually century-old tracks like a Pimlico, like a Churchill Downs, like a Belmont Park can do to have better surfaces or better stables and paddocks and whatnot for these animals?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to know. Certainly tracks have been tested with a lot of different surface types, and the industry will say that they're using state of the art, they're doing the best. There have been studies. It's inconclusive to me in terms of which one's better. Obviously, turf seems to present some. I mean, you look at UK death rates of horses, it's 1/10 of what happens in the United States. So I do think that track services are an issue. But then you have Santa Anita. It may have had to do with drainage issues and the precipitation in 2019. Obviously, we've heard a lot about tremendous rainfall in California the last few months, but in 2019 there was a lot of rain as well. So that's why it's difficult to pinpoint one specific thing. People have said 3-year-old racing or 2-year-old racing and track surfaces and bad trainers and doping and all sorts of other elements. And I think that's why if you have a metric on performance, and performance meaning a horse that runs in a race can walk off that track alive on his or her own power, then you start to figure out all those different elements. If your goal is let's keep the horse safe, you need to attend to each of those elements. If you look at it one dimensionally or single subject, we may not get the solutions that we want.
Yeah. And you mentioned Todd Pletcher's horse in the Derby, Forte, earlier, scratched because it was a Kentucky Racing Commission veterinarian that saw the bruised foot, and he's the morning line favorite, but hey, horse can't run, and scratched it. To that point, and to play a little bit of devil's advocate, people in the industry, in the horse racing industry, they would say, these are some of the best cared for animals in the world, better than some family members, more loved maybe than some family members, give or take how people, how deeply they're involved they are in the industry. That deaths are going to happen. Your organization advocates for zero and believes that zero is a target. Is that realistic? And what would you say to people that say this is a consequence of what happens in this sport, and that these are some of the best cared for animals in the world?
Well, if they're the best cared for animals and they're young and they're fit, they shouldn't be dying. So there's a contradiction there. I mean, you cannot have incredibly sound practices and good health and wellness for the horse and then have them die in a race. I mean, it's not a steeplechase. They're running on an oval with a groomed track, and they shouldn't be dying. And somehow it's become acceptable at some level, and I think we need to reset our understanding of what collateral damage occurs to horses. We should really have a far greater expectation of survivorship of competing horses.
Final question. Horse racing in this country, nearly a 2-century-old endeavor. The Kentucky, this will be the 148th Preakness on Saturday. Kentucky Derby turns 150 next year. The changes have happened, maybe slowly over the course of that time. Going forward, can horse racing continue to exist in this country as a safe and as an endeavor, period, let alone with increased safety and with better standards? Does horse racing have a future to be conducted safely with minimizing deaths and better care of the animals in this country?
Well, just like it's difficult to unpack exactly why so many horses have died recently, it's difficult to forecast the future for the horse racing industry. I mean, competition with gambling is a huge factor with the expansion of college sports betting and other forms of gambling, and people now having gambling options on their phones. I don't think that live animal competitions are going to fare well over time in terms of gambling interest. It's certainly been a trend that we've seen, and horse racing has persisted in part because of negotiated agreements for a minimum number of race days in the States when the casino-style operations expanded outside of Las Vegas and Atlantic City. So when that happened, horse racing kind of got locked in and they got some support. I think the biggest threat over time is just concerns about the welfare of the horses and just lack of interest, and how those two play out and which one's a bigger factor. Certainly, it's still a very viable industry. There are people who are deeply interested in it and participate. There's a big economic footprint. There's a connection to the horses. So those are the pieces that will keep horse racing around for the foreseeable future. But whether it's a slow decline or whether that decline can be arrested at some point and perhaps even reversed, I'm not sure. My guess is that people are just generally bored with it and that a lot of young people are not interested. So you'll have a very aging fan base, and the concerns about animal welfare are going to make sure that those younger people are not that interested. They can turn it around, show it's a non-lethal and very safe sport. Obviously, the animals have great appeal. There's no question about that.
Wayne Pacelle, president of Animal Wellness Action, great insight on the state of horse racing here ahead of the Preakness Stakes. I appreciate you joining me.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
My thanks again to Wayne for joining me and providing his insights. The 148th running of the Preakness Stakes is Saturday, May 20th from Baltimore. 8 horses are in the field, including Kentucky Derby winner Mage, who will try to become the 37th horse to win the first 2 stages of the Triple Crown. He is the favorite and will start from post 3 in the 8-horse field. And also, to the final point that we discussed about the future of horse racing, this year's numbers show that there's still an audience for it. 14.8 million viewers watched this year's Kentucky Derby. That makes it the 3rd most watched program on television so far this year, behind the Super Bowl and the Oscars. A reminder that you can find the District of Sports wherever you get your podcasts. That includes Apple, Google, Stitcher, and Spotify. Just search District of Sports in your favorite podcast app. Any reminder to follow us on Twitter at WashTime Sports, and for myself at Gerbo3. For the Washington Times, I'm George Gerbo. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.